back in Matthew 24. We are continuing looking at these familiar passages, rightly divided, or familiar passage, dispensationally considered. Last week, as we were in Matthew 24, we talked about verse 15. Well, we read all the way through the end to verse about 31, but we spent time talking about verse 15 of Matthew 24. When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place. And so we went from Matthew 24:15 and we went back to Daniel chapter 9. I should have drawn this chart out that's on the board last week, and that would have made it easier. I don't want to go back and reteach last week's lesson by any means, but if that chart helps us to understand, then think about what we studied. We talked about from from Daniel chapter 9. We went back and looked at the 70 weeks of Daniel. We talked about the 7 weeks, which were 49 years, covering that period of time under Ezra and Nehemiah when the second temple was rebuilt. And, or I should say the second temple was built, is how I should word that. The first temple, Solomon's temple, had been destroyed, and so a second temple was built in place of Solomon's temple that had been destroyed. So 49 years took place of that, so there were 7 weeks, and that's how Daniel breaks it down. He said 7 weeks, and then there's 62 weeks, or 62 weeks, and so he does that, and he said then it was a total then of 69 weeks to when Messiah shall be cut off, the crucifixion. And so we had that material there, and we looked at that last week, and I thought, well, I may not have been clear just in talking between weeks and years, and I may have made it more confusing, so I wanted to draw it out so we would see that. We looked at Luke chapter 4, where Jesus in the temple opens that portion there of Isaiah 61, and he begins reading verse 61 and 62, and he stopped there in the middle of verse 62 because he was talking about the preaching of the acceptable year of the Lord, and he stopped and closed it because at the end of Isaiah 61 verse 2, the second part of the verse, he talks about the day of vengeance, the day of wrath, which again is referenced back to that 70th week. So Jesus said the first part of that is fulfilled here in my coming, but he closed the book because the second part of that verse is not filled out here until this last week. And so we went through that. So there were 69 weeks from the decree going out to rebuild that temple to where Messiah is cut off. And that leaves then 1 week. We call that week the 70th week of Daniel. We call it, and I put the reference there in Jeremiah 30 verse 7 because it's referred to as the time of Jacob's trouble. John in the book of Revelation calls it the tribulation, and the entire period of the tribulation, and it lasts 3.5 years, the Great Tribulation, and as we studied before through the book of Revelation, we went through all that. But we've got this gap that takes place between the cross and this 70th week. Now, one of the things that I've always pointed out when you go into Acts chapter 2, and as I pick this up, we'll see it and look at it again a little bit, but in Acts chapter 2, I always talk about one of the aha moments for me as I first came to understand and first began to get a glimpse into rightly dividing the word of truth was in that phrase there in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost, Peter preaching to Israel under the anointed power of the outpouring of the Spirit, which was prophesied to Israel. Peter says, when they're asking about what they're seeing, Peter says, "This is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel." I always make a big deal of that. Because if this is that, then where were they? They were right there at the threshold of this 70th week of Daniel, this time of Jacob's trouble. They were right there at that threshold to go into that, because if you go back and read the book of Joel and the prophecy of Joel, it's all about the coming tribulation with the nation of Israel. And so Peter says, this is that. Well, that tells me right there the church could not have started. The church of which you and I are a part, the church which is His body, could not have started right there, because the next thing on God's prophetic timetable was this 70th week of Daniel. And so that's what they were looking for. And I reminded you that while Jesus is called the Christ, and the word Christ tells, and we read, it's there, thou art, Messiah should come, and Messiah is the Christ. And so in the New Testament we use the word Christ. In the Old Testament it was the word Messiah. The only one who talked about the Messiah and used that word in the Old Testament was Daniel. And so I think that's an interesting thing. If they're calling Him the Christ, the Messiah, there had to be some understanding of Daniel's prophecy back here. Everybody with me so far? All right. Now, Jesus closed that book, and He said, well, let's just read it over here in Matthew 24. I'm going to hit this for where we are right this minute, and then we'll pick up and carry on. But at verse 36 of Matthew 24, Jesus said, "But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only." Go over to Mark chapter 13. Mark chapter 13. And we've said that Matthew 24 and Mark 13 is the retelling of the same story by two different men. So you go back to Mark chapter 13. Verse 32. Mark 13:32, "But of that day and that hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels which are in heaven, neither the Son, but the Father." And so when Jesus is reading in Luke chapter 4, 16 through 21, He's reading out of Isaiah 61, and He stops halfway through that verse where He's saying, "Today I'm fulfilling this, preaching the acceptable year of the Lord, but the day of the outpouring of the wrath and the vengeance of God." He didn't read that because that wasn't yet. And then when we're in Matthew 24 and Mark 13, we find out, well, He closed the book. Why? Because He did not know when that week was going to take place. Everybody with me so far? Did I lose anybody? He doesn't continue reading because He tells us, I know where we are here and this is being fulfilled, but with additional information we find out He doesn't know when this is going to be fulfilled. So that's important. Alright, so we come through the death, burial, and resurrection. We know what takes place in the early Acts and the offering of the kingdom. We know that Israel rejected. And we know that her parenthetical, God saved Saul of Tarsus, introduced to him His gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ according to the revelation of the mystery. And so that begins to take place. So all that is there. In other words, this prophetic program was put on hold. That pause button was hit. But here's the proper assumption to make. Were the 69 weeks, have they been fulfilled? Yes, they have. Were they fulfilled literally? Yes, they were. Is there any reasonable thought to think, would there be any reason to think that if the 69 weeks were fulfilled literally, that the 70th week would not also be fulfilled literally? Well, that's pretty important. Because there's folks out there that'll tell you the 69 weeks were fulfilled literally, but the 70th week is all a spiritual thing. But that makes no sense, does it? All right. And so, hopefully we can understand, and that makes what we did last week maybe a little simpler to comprehend. Daniel 9, Matthew 24, talked about the abomination of desolations. That takes place halfway through. And I put the note here because it really kind of plays into all this. That second temple was built under Ezra and Nehemiah. It was destroyed in 70 AD. I mean, if Israel or the world needed a final understanding that what God was doing with Israel was put on hold, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD surely should be a sign of that. Paul died about 68 AD, 2 years after Paul's death. The temple's destroyed. But now when we read about the 70th week of Daniel, and we know about this abomination of desolations, and we read about the prophecies, well, for this 70th week to take place, for this 7-year period to take place, there has to be a temple, doesn't there? And so that tells us that there will be a third temple rebuilt out there.
Right. That's what it's telling you.
There will be a third temple rebuilt. And I don't know if y'all have done any of the research on it, but you know, there is that group over there in Jerusalem now. They've gathered up all the material. And they've got everything ready. All they need is some world leader to step on the stage and work out a peace agreement so that they can get the access to that property and rebuild that temple.
Amen. That's right.
So all that's going to take place. All of that, once again, is part of what tells us we're in this mystery. 70th week can't be fulfilled until we're gone and somebody raises up and lets Israel rebuild that third temple. Everybody there? Okay. The whole purpose of all that is bringing us back to this place when you're talking to somebody about the church, the body of Christ, and you're in Matthew 24. Matthew 24 doesn't have a thing to do with you or I. This all has to do with prophecy concerning Israel. We're not in Matthew 24 any way, shape, or form. Okay. All right. Now, let's go on from there, and let's pick up, let's see. Let's pick up at verse 27.
Seems like, Sam, that it'd be a good time to straighten out that time does not kick back in at the rapture necessarily. So therefore, we don't have to see that temple under construction now in order to determine.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that's a good point. The church is caught up to be with the Lord in the air, and so what Dad's saying is we don't have to see that temple rebuilt before we're caught up.
Right.
We don't have to see the peace made. In other words, all that takes place after we're gone. Then this peace treaty comes in place, and it could be a period of time.
That's right.
Luke 13. Begin at verse 6.
This helped me understand a lot when you explained this verse a
Yep.
long time ago.
Yep. Luke 13, begin at verse 6. And it goes right into the question, comment Dad made, and it helps us to understand that period between the rapture and so on. Chapter 13 of Luke, verse 6. He spake also this parable. A certain man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came and sought fruit thereon and found none. Then said he unto the dresser of his vineyard, Behold, these 3 years I come seeking fruit on this fig tree, and find none. Cut it down, why cumbereth it the ground? How long was the earth in the ministry of Christ? 3 years. How much fruit did Jesus have in 3 years? Hardly any. You know, think about it. There was what, 150 in the upper room in Acts chapter 2. He had very little fruit. All right, now, verse 8. And he answering said unto him, Lord, let it alone this year also, till I shall dig about it and dung it. And if it bear fruit, well, and if not, then after that thou shalt cut it down. And so 3 years there was a ministry. He said, it didn't bring forth any fruit. Let's just cut the thing off. He said, give me 1 more year. And in that 1 more year, we're going to leave it alone this year also, verse 8, till I dig about it and dung it. A year's ministry. After the 3 years, a year's time. If it bear fruit, well, and if not, then after that thou shalt cut it down. From the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ to the stoning of Stephen and salvation of Saul and Tarsus, guess how much time passed? A year. A year's time passed. What happened, we talk about it all the time. What was that event that shows us that the Israel's blasphemy against the Spirit and things began to change from Acts 7, 8, and then things began to change. And so there was a year's time. Remember what I say about Acts chapter 2? I say they're on the threshold of the tribulation. Excuse me. Jesus had given the prophecy and told about there being a year's time. Another year to see if we can bring forth fruit. Did they bring forth fruit? No, they didn't. That's when Israel was set aside, cut off, and diminished throughout the rest of the book of Acts. So all that took place after that 1 year. Now the point I'm making is this, that at the rapture of the church, there could be a period of time for things to take place, to set up the coming of the Antichrist, to set up the political things that need to take place. There could be how long? Could be a year. We don't know how long, but there could be a period of time, and certainly there must be a period of time. Wouldn't that make sense? And so that period of time for, and we can go back to Thessalonians, that day shall not come except there be a falling away first and that man of sin be revealed. Yeah. And so there's going to be a period of time from the, and I heard Rick using those phrases there, talking to Ray there. There's going to be that period of time after the pre-tribulation catching away of the body of Christ. Okay? And there's people that talk about mid-trib and post-trib and all this stuff. But the pre-tribulation rapture catching away of the body of Christ, there could be a period of time as God puts things in order that Antichrist be raised up, that peace be made in the Middle East, that Israel's given access to the Temple Mount. And when we studied through Revelation, we went through all the years and all the time, went back into prophecy, and we did all that when we studied through Revelation. But yeah, there could be a period of time. We don't have to see the temple being rebuilt. We don't even have to see Israel with access to the Temple Mount before we're, caught up. All that can take place after. I'm going to shut up there. Say something else and I don't need to say it. All right. So let's go back then to Matthew 24. Is that everybody good to go at this point? All right. That Luke 13, I need to mark that. That's one of those places I need to keep handy. Mark or Luke 13. All right. All right. So now we're back to Matthew 24. And let's read it, verse 27. For as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So this is the second coming of Christ to the earth. We talked about that a little bit. The rapture of the church is a secret thing. Nobody sees him but who? Us. But the second coming of Christ to the earth, as prophesied, as told about in Matthew 24, is talked about by John in the book of Revelation, Revelation 19, 20, 21, you get in there, every eye's going to see him. And notice at verse 30 it says, and then all the tribes of the earth, they're going to mourn when they see the Son of Man coming. In other words, they're in trouble. Alright? So that's the second coming of Christ to the earth. That is not the rapture of the church. Alright. Now verse 31. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet. And they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now, what I kind of do here is between verse 30 and verse 31, I want to inject verse 32 through the end of the chapter. Because when he comes back, will he indeed send his angels to gather his elect from the four corners? Yes, he will. But if we keep reading, we find out there's something that takes place in between verse 30 and 31. Okay? Alright, stay with me. Well, what takes place between verse 30 and 31? Start at verse 32. Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is nigh. So likewise, ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. What generation? The generation upon which these things that Matthew 24 talks about. Don't let anybody try to tell you, well, all this stuff was fulfilled because he said this generation will not pass. The generation he's talking about is the generation that sees what takes place in Matthew 24. That should help with that a whole lot. Okay. This generation. What generation? The generation he's talking to right there? No. The generation that the prophecy of Matthew 24 is talking about. Y'all with me? Okay. This generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. And we read Mark 13:32 a while ago. People have a tough time with the understanding that Jesus in his earthly ministry only knew what the Father told him. That's important. Whenever he spoke, he said, I know nothing of myself but what the Father giveth me. Does that mean he was any less God? No. But it means that he was that much more man. What he knew from the Father. Alright, verse 37. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away. What happened when the flood came? The unbelievers, all except for 8 souls, were taken all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Then shall 2 be in the field, the one shall be taken and the other left. Alright, at the rapture, if 2 are in the field and 1 is taken and other left, who's taken? The believer is taken and the other left. Here in Matthew 24, verse 40, and as we continue through, then shall 2 be in the field, the one shall be taken and the other left. Who's going to be taken here in Matthew 24? What's that?
For judgment.
The one that's taken away for judgment, and the other left to go into the kingdom. Big difference. But people will mix up Matthew 24 with the rapture, and they'll see that taken away and left, and they miss the whole thing. At the rapture, the saved are taken away, and the lost are left to go into the 70th week of Daniel. At the second coming, the saved are left to go into the kingdom, and the lost are taken away to be cast into the outer darkness. Okay? Keep reading. Verse 41. 2 women shall be grinding at the mill, the one shall be taken and the other left. Watch therefore, for you know not what hour your Lord doth come. But know this, that if the goodman of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, he would have watched and would not have suffered his house to be broken up. Therefore be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not, the Son of Man cometh. Let me ask you a question. Therefore be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not, the Son of Man cometh. You think that might tie in anything at all back here to verse 13? He that shall endure to the end, the same shall be saved. I tie those things together. I mean, because if you quit watching and you quit looking and you don't endure, you might find that you're taken and you're not left to go into the kingdom. Alright? Verse 45, who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his Lord hath made ruler over his household, to give them meat in due season? Blessed is that servant, whom his Lord, when he cometh, shall find so doing. Watching, praying, staying faithful, enduring to the end. Verily I say unto you that he shall make him ruler over all his goods. What happens to Israel when they come out of the tribulation and they go into the kingdom? What's it say? That they're going to become kings and priests, and they're going to rule with him for 1,000 years. Back over there in Revelation. All right. Let's see. Verse 48, and if that evil servant shall say in his heart, my Lord delayeth his coming, and shall begin to smite his fellow servants, and to eat and drink with the drunken, the Lord of that servant shall come in a day when he looketh not for him, in an hour that he's not aware of, and he shall cut him asunder, and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Do you think those folks that are following the Antichrist might be deceived, and he might convince them, hey boys, I got it all in control. You don't have to worry about God. And then all of a sudden, that eastern sky breaks, and here comes Jesus riding that white horse with those legions of angels coming with him. Go with me to Matthew 13. Turn back a couple of pages. Matthew 13 will help us with this as well. Matthew 13, begin reading at verse 24. Another parable, Matthew 13, 24. Another parable put he forth unto them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is likened unto a man which sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. But when the blade was sprung up and brought forth fruit, then appeared the tares also. So the servants of the householder came and said unto him, Sir, didst not thou sow good seed in thy field? From whence then hath it tares? He said unto them, An enemy hath done this. The servants said unto him, pay close attention, Wilt thou then that we go and gather them up? But he said, Nay, lest while ye gather up the tares, ye root up also the wheat with them. Let them both grow together until the harvest. And in the time of harvest I will say to the reapers, Gather ye together first the tares, and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. So when we go back here to Matthew 24, verse 31 is talking about gathering the wheat into the barn. Everybody there? Verse 31, he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. That's gathering the wheat into the barn. But what did they do first? First they gathered the tares and binded them in bundles so they would be burned. Everybody with me? So that's why I say, if you are reading verse 30, 31, draw you a little arrow between those two verses and tie it back into Matthew 13, and you find out what he's saying in 32 through 51 is the gathering of the tares into bundles to be burned. And you do that first. And then he gathers the wheat into the barn. Does this make sense to everybody? Everybody there? Okay. All right. So, with all that being said, we're going to conclude Matthew 24 as, and hopefully we've got an understanding when we go to Matthew. Don't ever let anyone take you to Matthew 24 and talk to you about the rapture or the catching away of the body of Christ. Don't let anybody put you there, because my friend, praise God and glory to His grace, we ain't there. And we need to understand that. Hopefully we've covered enough material to help us understand that. And there we go. Questions or comments about this? We good? Yes, sir.
We had well, with Father's house, we had a Jewish believer that, you know, of course, didn't believe in Christ.
Yeah.
That brought pictures of the belts and the stuff that
All the stuff they're making.
all they're making, and
Yeah.
man, I'll tell you, they got about all that stuff. The red heifer, all that stuff about done. So does that mean that the time is really close now?
Well, let's say this, they're preparing. You know, they're preparing. Of course, what are they preparing? They're preparing for a first coming Messiah.
Right.
And when that world leader shows up on the scene, gives them access to the Temple Mount, lets them rebuild that thing and makes peace, they're going to believe that that's the Christ. They're going to think the Antichrist is the Messiah.
Okay.
See where I'm going? So I always talk about the difference between believing Israel and unbelieving Israel.
Would it be the,
Are they looking for a first coming Messiah or a second coming?
that's what I'm asking.
Yeah.
What
Oh,
do
those
they
folks-
bel- What do they believe?
Oh, those folks, they do not, you know, they're
They don't
still,
believe in Christ. I know that.
no, they're still looking for a first coming Messiah.
Right,
They do not believe that Jesus of Nazareth was the Son of God.
right.
And that's why when you go through there and you read Hebrews through Revelation, in light of the tribulation, what's going on during that time, and when, and understanding that Israel must believe on Jesus of Nazareth as the Son of God, that comes back to the difference between those who are believers and those who are unbelievers. Are they looking for a first coming Christ, which they will see fulfilled in the Antichrist, or are they looking for a second coming Christ, therefore believing that Jesus of Nazareth, who lived 2,000 years ago, died, was buried, and rose again, that they're looking for Him to come back, what we've been reading Matthew 24, establish that kingdom, sit upon that throne of David, and do all that.
Because the new temple doesn't have to be built where the other ones are now.
Oh yeah, it's got to be built there.
That's gonna be a trip.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this question.
How are we gonna do that one?
If there's anybody who could broker a deal, I mean, we may be 100 years away from the rapture. We don't know. But as I sit here and look today, if there's anybody who could broker a deal in the Middle East that would let Israel have that Temple Mount back,
He'll be Garland.
who do you think could do that?
Garland himself.
You know, I don't know. All right, well anyway, that's it. All right, when we come back next time, we're going to go some other places. I may take us to, we've pretty well covered in our study of Matthew 24. We went after Matthew 28 and the Great Commission. We dealt with that, I think, already. But we may pick up, we may go into John chapter 3. And because, once again, familiar passages dispensationally considered. There's oftentimes an argument, what about John 3:16? Well, we need to go in and understand about John 3:16 and about John chapter 3. All right, very good. Any other questions? I want you to take note. It is 7 minutes till 12. Let's have a word of prayer, sing our song, and then we're done. Or sing, yeah, how do we do that?
Have a word of prayer.
Have a word of prayer and sing our song, and then we're done. All right. Gary, would you dismiss us, please?